Welcome to Boring Religion for Sleep, where we explore the deep mysteries of faith. Very slowly. Tonight, we're diving into a curious question. Why does Jesus always seem to wait 3 days? Why not 1? Why not 7? What's with the holy delay? So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let your thoughts drift like a boat on calm waters. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Whether you're in a tiny village or a big city, you're welcome here. Now let's gently begin. Throughout the Bible, the pattern of 3 days appears again and again, like a quiet drumbeat beneath the surface of the stories. It's easy to miss, and yet once you notice it, you begin to wonder if something deeper is going on. Why 3 days? Why not 2, or 5, or 10? Jesus rose on the 3rd day. That much most people remember. But long before Jesus, this pattern had already been established, woven into the spiritual DNA of the scriptures. For instance, in the Old Testament, Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights inside the belly of the great fish, trapped in darkness, in fear, in silence, a kind of living tomb beneath the waves. But after those 3 days, Jonah was spit out, restored, released, changed. His second chance came not in the moment of crisis, but after the waiting. Another example, the Israelites, just before they were to encounter God at Mount Sinai, were told to consecrate themselves for 3 days. They had been freed from Egypt, yes, but they weren't ready to meet the divine face to face. They needed time to wash, to reflect, to prepare, to shift from the chaos of slavery to the quiet reverence required to stand before the Almighty. Again, 3 days, not for dramatic effect, but for inner transformation. And then there is Abraham. When God asked him to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, Abraham walked for 3 full days before reaching the mountain. 3 days of wrestling silently with what he was being asked to do. 3 days to feel the full weight of the test. The journey wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, existential. Abraham needed those days, just as much as we might need time to accept a painful truth or make a difficult decision. In Jewish tradition, numbers aren't just quantities, they're symbols. 3, in particular, is the number of stability. Think of a stool with 3 legs, firm, balanced, unshakable. The number 3 signals a kind of wholeness, a beginning, a middle, and an end. It marks the process of becoming. In that context, the 3 days of Jesus' death and resurrection take on even more meaning. His followers didn't just need time to believe, they needed time to grieve, to experience the full weight of loss, to sit in the stillness of Saturday, that in-between day when it felt like all hope was gone. If Jesus had risen immediately, the depth of that despair wouldn't have had time to settle in. And if despair never settles, the joy of resurrection can't pierce through it with the same force. 3 days give space for transformation. It's a sacred pause, a moment in time long enough to feel the pain, to process the confusion, and to begin, just begin, to wonder if something more might be coming. And that's the gift of the pattern. It shows us that God is never in a hurry, that mystery unfolds slowly, that the most powerful stories are not the ones that race to the end, but the ones that take their time, let us wander through the darkness and bring us back to the light. So when Jesus waited 3 days, he wasn't just fulfilling a prophecy. He was tapping into an ancient rhythm, a holy timing, one that reminds us resurrection is never rushed. It takes time. It always has. Jesus died on a Friday. By evening, his body was taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen, and laid in a tomb carved from rock. A stone was rolled in front of the entrance, and then silence. No thunder from the heavens, no angel choirs, no last-minute miracle. Just stillness, quiet. A body, lifeless and cold, resting in the shadows of a sealed grave. That moment, when everything stops, is one of the most overlooked parts of the Christian story. We talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection. We focus on the suffering, and we celebrate the victory. But in between those two great events is something far more unsettling. The waiting, the emptiness, the 3 days when nothing seemed to happen at all. And yet, those 3 days were everything. From the outside, it would have looked like failure. A man who claimed to be the Son of God was now buried, like any other man. His followers scattered, his mother grieving, his enemies satisfied. The world moved on. Rome didn't notice. The temple carried on with its rituals. Life, it seemed, continued, while Jesus lay still. But that stillness was not meaningless. In fact, it was essential. Because without the stillness, there is no contrast. Without the weight of death, the lightness of resurrection feels hollow. If Jesus had risen immediately after dying, if he had leapt off the cross in some divine show of power, the world would have been amazed, yes, but it would have missed something deeper, something more human, more real. Grief takes time. When we lose someone we love, there is a numbness, a disbelief that settles in. The hours stretch, the seconds sting, and as time passes, the reality of loss begins to sink in. The finality of death becomes undeniable. That process, the process of truly feeling the absence, is what makes any return, any hope, feel like a miracle. Jesus didn't just overcome death. He entered it fully. He allowed it to do what it does, bring silence, bring sorrow, bring emptiness. He let the world experience what it felt like to lose him, to feel abandoned, to wonder if any of it had meant anything at all. That experience was not a mistake. It was necessary for the disciples, for the world, even for us. The second day, Saturday, is perhaps the most haunting. Friday brought the trauma. Sunday would bring the joy. But Saturday, that was the day of uncertainty, the in-between, the day when the tomb was closed and the future was unclear. Imagine what his followers must have felt. The confusion, the guilt, the hopelessness, dreams shattered, faith shaken. Some had given up everything to follow him, left their homes, abandoned their careers, believed with their whole hearts that he was the Messiah. And now, he was gone. The tomb was not just a place of death. It became a symbol of doubt, of everything that didn't make sense. But it was also a place of quiet transformation. Hidden from human eyes, something was happening. Not a spectacle, but something sacred. The silence was not empty. It was full of mystery, full of God's quiet work. A seed doesn't burst through the soil immediately. It lies buried first. The roots go deep before anything blooms. In the same way, Jesus' body lay in the ground, not as a defeat, but as a beginning. We often rush through the story. We want to get to Easter Sunday, to the joy, the celebration. But if we skip the stillness, we miss the heartbeat of the story. Because the stillness is where we live most of our lives, in between sorrow and hope, between the cross and the resurrection. We know what it is to wait in the dark, unsure if the light will return. And in that way, the 3 days Jesus spent in the tomb are not just about him. They're about us. They teach us that silence is not the absence of God, that waiting is not wasting, that sometimes The greatest work happens when nothing seems to be happening at all. So when Jesus waited in the tomb, he was showing us that death must be honored. That stillness has a purpose. That transformation comes slowly, silently, sacredly. He was gone, but not forgotten. Silent, but not absent. And when the stone finally rolled away, it was not just a miracle. It was the result of everything those 3 quiet days had prepared us for. In the modern world, we think of time in precise, mechanical terms. Seconds ticking by on a clock, minutes turning into hours, deadlines, schedules, countdowns. We live by the clock, and often we suffer by it too. We want instant results, instant answers, instant relief. But the ancient world saw time differently, and to truly understand the meaning behind Jesus waiting 3 days, we need to step into that ancient mindset, especially the way time was understood in Jewish tradition. To begin with, in Jewish culture, a new day didn't begin at sunrise, it began at sunset. This was rooted in the creation story in Genesis, where each day of creation is marked by the phrase, "And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day." For us, it seems backward, but for the Jewish people, the night came first, darkness, then light, sleep, then waking, stillness, then movement. In a way, even their sense of time pointed toward spiritual transformation, toward the idea that light comes after darkness, not before. This helps us understand why Jesus' 3 days in the tomb are counted the way they are. He was crucified and buried late on Friday, before sunset. That counts as day 1. Saturday, the Sabbath, was day 2. And Sunday morning, even though it was early and dark, was already day 3, because the new day had technically begun the night before. In Western terms, it feels like a stretch, not quite 3 full 24-hour periods. But to the people of that time, this counting wasn't just acceptable, it was meaningful. Still, if it were just about measuring time, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Because the truth is, the phrase 3 days wasn't just about marking the calendar. It was symbolic. It carried spiritual weight. It had a rhythm, a resonance. It was a way of saying, this is enough time for something important to happen. This is how long it takes for something to change. The number 3 had deep significance in the Hebrew tradition. It appears constantly throughout Scripture. On the 3rd day of creation, dry land appeared, and life began to form. God called it good. On the 3rd day, Abraham reached the mountain where he would offer Isaac. On the 3rd day, God came down on Mount Sinai to give the law. Over and over again, the 3rd day was the moment of divine encounter, divine action, divine clarity. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a pattern, a spiritual rhythm. The people of the Bible understood that important things took time, but not forever. The 3rd day marked the point where something hidden became visible, where confusion turned to revelation, where waiting turned into movement. Not instantly, but not endlessly either. It was the moment of turning. So when Jesus said he would rise on the 3rd day, he was speaking in language his followers would understand, not just with their minds, but with their souls. He was saying, you'll have to wait, but not too long. There will be darkness, but it won't last. There will be stillness, but it won't be the end. That way of thinking is so different from ours. We tend to see waiting as wasted time, as emptiness, as nothing. But in the Jewish worldview, waiting had depth. It was active, not passive. It was a time of trust, of reflection, of preparation. And when that time reached its sacred number, 3 days, something would break open. Something would change. Even mourning had its own rhythms. After a loved one died, Jewish families observed Shiva, a 7-day period of intense mourning. But even within that, the first 3 days were set apart as the most sorrowful, the most raw. In those 3 days, the pain was freshest, the shock was greatest, and then slowly, little by little, the healing could begin. Again, that number, 3, appears, not as a random measure of time, but as a threshold between agony and recovery. Jesus' 3 days in the tomb followed this sacred logic. They were not accidental. They matched a pattern woven deeply into the spiritual consciousness of his people. And perhaps even more beautifully, they acknowledged something universal about the human heart, that when we experience loss, when we face despair, we need time to feel it, to process it, to come to terms with it. Jesus didn't skip the process. He honored it. He allowed his followers to mourn, to question, to feel abandoned. He let the silence speak. And in doing so, he didn't just fulfill a prophecy. He fulfilled a need, the need for grief, the need for slowness, the need for meaning in the waiting. So when you find yourself in a season of stillness, in a stretch of time where God feels silent or distant, remember, he's not ignoring you. He's moving according to a rhythm older than the clock, a rhythm that counts not just the hours, but the healing, not just the days, but the depth of what they hold. 3 days, in that ancient tradition, was not a delay. It was a divine promise. Hold on, wait a little longer, light is coming. In the ancient world, numbers were not merely tools for counting, they were vessels of meaning, symbols, sacred patterns. While we modern thinkers often separate math from mystery, ancient people did not. They saw significance in repetition, in structure, in the rhythm of creation itself. For them, numbers weren't cold or clinical. They were spiritual. They told stories. They echoed truths that couldn't be explained with words alone. And among all the numbers that appeared in ancient texts and traditions, the number 3 stood out as especially powerful, especially whole. To understand why Jesus waited 3 days before rising, we must understand how people of his time viewed numbers, not just as mathematical facts, but as cosmic fingerprints of divine design. And the number 3, in particular, was the number of completion, balance, and transcendence. Look around the world and you'll see it. Beginnings, middles, and ends. Past, present, and future. Heaven, earth, and underworld. The human being, body, mind, and spirit. Even time itself was understood in 3s. There is something deeply embedded in the way we experience life that seems to gravitate toward triads. This wasn't lost on ancient people. They believed that anything that came in 3s wasn't just orderly. It was sacred, full, stable. Think of a stool, 2 legs and it tips over, 4 legs and it can wobble. But 3 is just enough, the perfect balance. That was how people viewed the spiritual world as well. 3 meant something was complete. So when the story of Jesus is told using a 3-day framework, it wasn't just a storytelling convenience. It was a spiritual declaration. It was saying, this event, this process, this journey, it has a divine fullness. It is not random. It is rooted in the very structure of reality. Even in pagan cultures surrounding the ancient Jews, the number 3 held mystical meaning. In Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was killed and brought back to life after a 3-day journey through the underworld. In Greek myths, there were 3 fates, 3 Gorgons, 3 Graces. In Norse legend, 3 Norns controlled the threads of destiny. Over and over again, we find cultures reaching for the number 3 as a symbol of cosmic truth, a way of saying something important is unfolding. But nowhere was this more deeply felt than in the Hebrew scriptures. Over and over, 3 becomes the number that marks a divine moment. On the third day of creation, life begins to appear. Plants and trees grow from the land. On the third day, God meets his people on Mount Sinai. On the third day, Jonah is released from the fish. Over and over again, the third day becomes a doorway, an entry point into something new. Even in the rituals of Jewish worship, the number 3 played a role. The high priest would sprinkle blood 3 times in the Holy of Holies. Prayers were offered 3 times a day. Blessings often came in sets of 3 lines. It was believed that something done 3 times wasn't just an act. It was a covenant, a spiritual reality being sealed and confirmed. Jesus' resurrection on the third day wasn't merely a scheduling decision. It was a spiritual echo, an alignment with a deep and ancient truth that the people of his time would have understood in their bones. It was the rhythm of creation repeating itself once more, but this time with cosmic finality, life out of death, light out of darkness, completion out of brokenness. And the idea of 3 days also resonated with the way transformation was understood. Change was not believed to be instant. True change, spiritual change, required a process. And 3 was the minimum number of steps to reflect that. There had to be a beginning, the moment of crisis or descent. There had to be a middle, the place of waiting, confusion, suffering, and there had to be an end, the return, the renewal, the resurrection. This is the rhythm of every meaningful journey. We fall, we wait, we rise, not in 2 parts, but in 3. So when Jesus said, "The Son of Man will be delivered over to be crucified, and on the third day be raised," he was doing more than making a prediction. He was declaring that he would walk the sacred path, the ancient rhythm. He would not shortcut death. He would not skip the silence. He would not avoid the middle. And by walking that path, he brought everything into alignment, not just with prophecy, but with the very heartbeat of the cosmos. He made it clear, his death and resurrection were not random events in time. They were a sacred repetition of a divine truth told again in the flesh, a truth that every culture, every soul seems to intuit, that the deepest changes do not happen instantly, they happen in 3s. So if you ever find yourself in that middle place, in the silence between heartbreak and healing, between the old and the new, remember this ancient pattern. You are not lost. You are not forgotten. You are in the middle of something sacred. You are in day 2, and day 3 is coming. Long before Jesus was ever laid in a tomb, another man descended into darkness for 3 days and lived to tell the tale. His name was Jonah. His story, found in one of the shortest books of the Old Testament, is often remembered for its dramatic imagery. A prophet swallowed by a great fish, cast into the depths of the sea, and then miraculously spit out onto dry land. But this isn't just a story about a miraculous rescue. It's a foreshadowing, a shadowy echo of something much greater to come. Jonah's journey begins with disobedience. God tells him to go to Nineveh, a city known for its wickedness, and call them to repentance. But Jonah runs the other way. He boards a ship, sails toward Tarshish, and tries to escape not just his mission, but God himself. It doesn't work. A storm arises, the sailors panic. Jonah knows he's the cause, and he tells them to throw him into the sea. They do. The sea calms, and Jonah sinks. Now comes the moment that links his story to Jesus. As Jonah is swallowed by the great fish, he enters a place that is both terrifying and symbolic. For 3 days and 3 nights, he remains in the belly of the beast, trapped, entombed, alone. It's a place of isolation, of darkness, of death in life. No light, no sound, just the slow pulse of the deep and the quiet hum of divine mystery. What's happening in those 3 days? On the surface, it looks like nothing. Jonah isn't preaching. He isn't working miracles. He isn't even speaking to anyone. But beneath that stillness, transformation is taking place. Jonah is being broken down, not physically, but spiritually. He is being forced to confront himself, his fears, his pride, and his resistance to God's will. He is, quite literally, in a womb of darkness, waiting to be reborn. And Jonah is reborn. After 3 days, the fish spits him out onto dry land. He is given a second chance, a new beginning. This time, he obeys. He goes to Nineveh. He delivers God's message. And a city on the brink of destruction is spared. Now, fast forward, centuries later, to Jesus himself. When the Pharisees and teachers of the law ask him for a sign, he replies, "No sign will be given to this generation except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth." In that moment, Jesus draws a direct connection between Jonah's descent into the fish and his own coming death and burial. But what does that mean? It means Jonah's experience wasn't just a strange event. It was a prophetic symbol, a mirror image. Jonah entered the belly of the fish. Jesus entered the belly of the earth. Jonah spent 3 days in darkness. Jesus spent 3 days in the tomb. Jonah was cast overboard and thought lost. Jesus was crucified and declared dead. Jonah emerged with a message of mercy. Jesus rose with the promise of eternal life. And just like Jonah's 3 days were not wasted, neither were Jesus. This is the quiet beauty of the parallel. Both journeys are about surrender. Both are about going into the depths, not to escape life, but to face what lies beneath it. In Jonah's case, it was his stubbornness, his fear, his belief that some people didn't deserve God's love. In Jesus' case, it was the weight of sin itself, the collective pain and brokenness of the world. And both of them emerged changed. Jonah with renewed purpose, Jesus with resurrection power. There's something more too. Jonah's story shows that even in rebellion, even in failure, God can bring transformation. Jonah tried to run away, but even his escape became a pathway to redemption. The sea that should have swallowed him became his salvation. The fish that should have been his grave became his shelter. The darkness that should have ended his story became the beginning of something entirely new. Jesus, of course, was no runaway prophet. He didn't flee from God's command. He embraced it. But he still entered that same symbolic space, the space of darkness, of silence, of waiting. And by doing so, he redeemed that pattern completely. He took Jonah's story and every story like it and fulfilled it in the most perfect way. That's why the 3 days matter. It's not just that Jesus rose. It's that he rose after waiting, after being still, after going down into the depths like Jonah. If he had risen instantly, the connection would be lost. The pattern would be broken. But because he waited, because he let the silence speak, he showed us that every descent has a purpose, that even the darkest tomb is not the end. And for us, the message is deeply personal, because we too find ourselves in the belly of the fish, in times of confusion, despair, regret, or failure. Times when we feel cut off, swallowed by circumstances, drifting in darkness, and we wonder, is this the end? Has God forgotten me? But Jonah's story and Jesus says no, this is not the end. This is the middle. This is the place where something invisible is happening. You may not feel it. You may not see it. But beneath the silence, beneath the waiting, something is stirring. Something is preparing to rise. The sign of Jonah is more than a prophecy. It is a promise. A promise that even when you've sunk to your lowest, even when the world is dark and still, resurrection is coming. It may take 3 days. It may take longer, but it will come. Because the God who met Jonah in the deep is the same God who raised Jesus from the dead, and the same God who is with you even now in your quietest night. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, we find one of the most haunting and sacred moments in all of Scripture. A test of faith so intense, so mysterious, that it continues to stir hearts thousands of years later. But hidden within that story is something that many overlook. The journey took 3 days. When God calls Abraham and commands him to take his beloved son, Isaac, the child of promise, the miracle born in old age, and offer him as a sacrifice, the command is clear, and Abraham obeys without hesitation. But the fulfillment of that command doesn't happen immediately. There is no instant resolution, no quick flash of obedience followed by divine intervention. Instead, there is a journey. The Bible tells us, almost in passing, that Abraham traveled for 3 days before reaching the mountain where the sacrifice was to take place. Those 3 days are easy to gloss over when reading the story quickly, but slow down, and you begin to feel the weight of them. Imagine what those days must have been like. The tension, the silence, the dread. Every step forward was a step closer to what felt like the unthinkable. Abraham walked beside his son, the very one he had waited for with tears and prayers and years of longing, the son in whom all the promises of God were wrapped. And yet, with every mile they traveled, Abraham believed, on some level, that he was heading toward his death, not his own, but his son's. Why would God ask this of him? Why test him like this? And more importantly, why make him wait 3 whole days? The answer, perhaps, lies in the mystery of what those days represent. Not just for Abraham, but for all who are asked to surrender something deeply precious. Because 3 days of waiting is not just a delay, it is a space for wrestling, for questioning, for searching the heart, for learning to trust even when nothing makes sense. It is not punishment, it is transformation. Had Abraham reached the mountain in 1 day, he might have acted out of shock, or adrenaline, or spiritual momentum. But 3 days, that's long enough for doubts to grow, for hope to flicker and fade, for grief to mature into full awareness. Every night he lay down to sleep, Abraham would have stared up at the stars, the same stars God once asked him to count, and wondered, was this really the plan? And every morning he would rise, look at his son, and choose to keep going, not because it made sense, but because he trusted the one who sent him. That's what makes Abraham's journey so powerful. It wasn't a blind act of faith done in a flash. It was a long, painful walk, a quiet struggle, a father carrying the weight of obedience with each heavy step. And Isaac, he walked too. He asked questions. "Father, where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" And Abraham answered with trembling hope, God himself will provide. It is in that space, the 3-day journey, that faith is refined. Not in the moment of arrival, not even in the miracle, but in the walk, the in-between, the days when nothing changes, and yet everything is being tested. Abraham's journey becomes a mirror for our own spiritual lives, because we too are asked to give things up, to let go, to surrender what we love most, our plans, our control, our comfort, our pride. And we too often find ourselves walking through those long, uncertain stretches of time where God's promises seem to be in conflict with His commands. He says He will bless us and yet asks us to wait. He says He loves us and yet allows pain. He gives us a dream and then asks us to lay it down. And like Abraham, we walk, sometimes slowly, sometimes in silence, and always with the question echoing in our hearts, will God really provide? What's beautiful and heartbreaking is that Abraham didn't have the end of the story. He didn't know that God would stop him at the last moment, that a ram would appear in the thicket, that his son would be spared, that his obedience would become a symbol of faith for generations to come. All he had was the walk, the silence, the trust, 3 days of holding on. And isn't that the very shape of the gospel? Because generations later, another son would walk up a hill carrying wood on his back, just like Isaac. But this time, no voice would call out to stop the sacrifice. No ram would appear, because Jesus was the Lamb. And his 3 days were not spent walking up a mountain. They were spent lying in a tomb between death and life, between agony and glory. Abraham's 3 days prepared him to see the God who provides. Jesus' 3 days revealed the God who becomes the provision. So when we are in our own 3-day seasons, when we are walking through uncertainty, carrying the weight of unanswered prayers, trembling with the fear of what might be lost, we can remember Abraham. We can remember that faith is not forged in a flash of light, but in a long journey through shadow. That obedience is not about understanding, but about trusting the one who sees what we cannot. And when we reach our own Mount Moriah, whatever that may look like, we may just discover what Abraham did, that God was never cruel, that the test was never about loss. It was about transformation, about learning to trust when we couldn't see, about discovering that even in the hardest places, God will provide. He always does. But sometimes it takes 3 days to see it. Something mysterious happens when we are made to wait, when we're caught in that strange space between what was and what's next. It can feel like the most powerless part of life, those in-between moments when nothing seems to be happening, and yet something inside us is being transformed. That's the deeper truth hidden in the story of Jesus' 3 days in the tomb. The waiting itself is holy. When Jesus died on the cross, his followers were devastated. Their teacher, their friend, their Messiah, crucified like a criminal. It was not just the loss of a man they loved. It was the collapse of their entire worldview. The future they imagined was suddenly gone. And with it, their hope. Friday had been a day of trauma. Sunday would be a day of glory. But Saturday was something else entirely. Saturday was the day of silence. The tomb was sealed. The streets were quiet. The disciples were scattered. And the women who had followed Jesus prepared spices to anoint his body, not knowing if they'd even be able to reach him through the guards and the stone. Grief had settled in. Not the loud, gasping grief of immediate shock, but the slow, dull ache of something lost that cannot be replaced. This is the experience of the second day, the middle day, the day when all you have is emptiness, no answers, no signs, no comfort, just waiting. And that waiting is deeply human. We all know it. The person who loses a loved one and walks through a house that feels unbearably quiet. The one who receives bad news but hasn't yet told their children. The person who's been praying for a breakthrough for years and hears only silence. The marriage that's broken but not yet healed. The diagnosis that hasn't turned into a cure. The prayer that hasn't turned into a miracle. These are our Saturdays. They are the days when we want to believe in Sunday, but Friday still lives in our bones. They are the days when faith feels far away, not gone, just bruised. They are the days when our spiritual life isn't loud or poetic or triumphant. It's tired, quiet, gritty. But these are also the days when the soul learns to breathe again, because something happens in the waiting. Something invisible, something sacred. The heart broken open by loss, becomes fertile soil for a new kind of hope. Not the naive kind, not the loud, enthusiastic kind, but the kind that is anchored in something deeper, something truer. In the stillness of the tomb, Jesus' body lay cold and unmoving. But the silence of those 3 days was not lifeless. It was pregnant with resurrection. Heaven was not idle. The darkness was not forgotten. Something was shifting in the fabric of existence. The stone had not yet rolled away, but eternity was already unfolding. This is the hidden work of the waiting. We think of waiting as nothing, as pause, as failure. But in the eyes of God, waiting is part of the story. It's where we wrestle, where we come undone, where our illusions are stripped away, and we finally ask, who am I without the answers? Who is God when I can't hear him? Can love really survive the silence? And somehow, in the quiet, the answers begin to rise. Not loudly, not quickly, but gently. Like light filtering into a dark room. Like dawn rising just beyond the horizon. Not yet seen, but already promised. The disciples didn't know it, but they were being shaped by that silence. Their faith, though shaken, was being rooted in something deeper than emotion. The women who waited at the tomb weren't just performing a burial ritual, they were bearing witness to the sacred. Their grief became a kind of prayer, their stillness a form of worship. This is how the soul grows. In the waiting, we learn that we are not in control, and we never were. We learn to let go of our need to fix, to understand, to plan. We learn to hold our pain without demanding an immediate resolution. We learn to trust, not in outcomes, but in presence. Not in what we see, but in who we are becoming. Because God does some of his deepest work in silence. The waiting teaches us to breathe again, to slow down, to let go of the panic that tells us we must always be moving, achieving, solving. In the stillness, we hear things we never heard before, our own hearts, our own wounds, the gentle whisper of the Spirit. And maybe that's why Jesus waited. Maybe that's why he didn't rise immediately, because humanity needed to sit in the stillness, to feel the weight of loss, to live inside the question, so that when the answer came, it would be more than a surprise, it would be a resurrection. Resurrection means more when you've truly tasted death. Hope means more when you've known despair. Joy means more when it has grown in the soil of sorrow. So if you are in a season of waiting, know this: you are not forgotten. You are not being punished. You are being held. The silence is not empty. It is sacred space. It is the tomb before the stone rolls away. It is the womb before new life begins. Nothing visible may be happening, but everything is changing. You are not stuck. You are not alone. You are in the holy pause, the sacred middle, the place where grief becomes grace and silence becomes the beginning of a song. To us, time is a relentless, ticking force. Seconds turn into minutes, minutes into hours, and we feel every one of them as they pass. We plan our lives by calendars and clocks. We measure success by speed. We are trained, almost conditioned, to expect results quickly. If something doesn't happen when we think it should, we begin to panic. We ask questions. We feel abandoned. We wonder if something's gone wrong. That's how we experience time. But with God, time flows differently. To understand why Jesus waited 3 days, why he didn't rise immediately after dying, we must first understand this truth. Divine timing is not our timing. What feels like a delay to us is often part of a deeper process to God. What we interpret as absence might actually be preparation, and what looks like stillness on the surface may, in fact, be the most profound kind of spiritual activity, happening in realms we cannot see, at a pace we cannot measure. This disconnect between human time and divine time is one of the great challenges of faith. We ask, why hasn't it happened yet? But God is not rushed. His work is not driven by anxiety or urgency. He is never late, because he is never in a hurry. He moves with intention. He unfolds his plans with perfect precision, not according to the pressure of the moment, but according to the eternal rhythms of the soul. When Jesus waited in the tomb, it wasn't because he needed rest. It wasn't because the resurrection was technically complicated or delayed by some spiritual bureaucracy. He waited because the world needed to feel the absence. The disciples needed to feel the silence. The fullness of grief had to settle in. The finality of death had to become real. Only then could resurrection be recognizable. Only then could the joy of new life be felt in its full depth. If he had risen immediately, if he had walked off the cross before the sun set on Friday, it would have felt more like a stunt than a sacrifice. People might have clapped and cheered, but the truth wouldn't have pierced their hearts. There would have been no time to mourn, no time to doubt, no time to sit in that aching question. Was he really the one? No time for the shadow of death to fall fully upon them. And without that shadow, the light of resurrection loses some of its brilliance. The 3 days were not a flaw in the plan. They were the plan. Throughout Scripture, God often allows time to stretch in ways that challenge human understanding. He promises a son to Abraham, but waits decades before Isaac is born. He delivers his people from Egypt, but takes them the long way through the wilderness. He anoints David as king, but lets him live in caves for years before placing him on the throne. Time for God is not an obstacle. It's a sculptor. He uses it to form us, to stretch us, to refine what is raw and immature into something that can bear the weight of glory. In our waiting, we often want to escape, but in God's view, the waiting is the sacred space where transformation happens. We want instant answers, but God wants eternal change. So when Jesus waited those 3 days, he was showing us a different way to live, a different relationship with time. He was saying, let the silence do its work. Let the sorrow ripen into wisdom. Let the question grow deep enough to hold the answer when it comes. It's hard. Waiting is uncomfortable, especially when you don't know what's coming next. But that's where faith matures. Not in the miracle, but in the middle, in the space where we don't yet see, and still we trust. That's where our souls are stretched beyond the limitations of clock and calendar, into the wide, slow movement of eternity. And in that eternal space, God is never rushed. He doesn't panic. He doesn't skip steps. He doesn't cater to our impatience. He waits. And in his waiting, he invites us to do the same, not as a punishment, but as an invitation. To slow down, to listen, to surrender our timelines and make room for his. The 3 days Jesus spent in the tomb were not just symbolic. They were an act of compassion. He was giving the world time to feel, time to mourn, time to reflect, time to shift from one way of seeing to another. Time for the old to truly die, so the new could be born without confusion. And this isn't just about what happened then. It's about what happens now. In every season of your life where God seems silent, where nothing is moving, where the prayers feel like they go unanswered and the tomb remains sealed. This same truth applies. Time feels different with God. You are not being ignored. You are being prepared. He is not absent. He is present in a way that does not scream or shout, but whispers through the walls of your heart. He is not late. He is deliberate. And maybe the stone hasn't rolled away yet, not because he can't move it, but because something inside you is still being shaped. So trust the silence, trust the delay, trust the space between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Because with God, the wait is never wasted. We live in a world that glorifies immediacy, fast answers, instant results, overnight success. These are the rhythms we expect. And when something takes time, we assume something's wrong. We become anxious, restless. We question the plan. We question ourselves. Sometimes we even question God. So it's only natural to wonder, why didn't Jesus rise immediately after his death? If he truly had power over life and death, why not get up from the cross, wipe the blood from his brow, and reveal his glory right then and there? Wouldn't that have been more impressive, more convincing? Wouldn't that have stunned the world into belief? But God does not operate by spectacle. He is not interested in dazzling the eyes without first transforming the heart. And that's the reason why Jesus didn't rise immediately. Because the resurrection was not a magic trick. It was a slow, sacred process. A process that needed time, silence, and sorrow to do its work. An instant resurrection might have shocked people, but it would not have changed them. There would have been no time for grief to settle, no space for doubt to stretch, no opportunity for faith to be tested. People would have cheered, yes, but would they have understood? Would they have followed him with their whole hearts, or merely been entertained? Jesus didn't come to entertain. He came to redeem. And redemption is never rushed. 3 days gave space for the world to feel the full weight of his absence, for his disciples to wrestle with their shattered hopes, for the silence to sink into their souls. That silence was not accidental. It was essential, because resurrection only means something if death feels real. Hope only matters if hopelessness has been tasted. Without the 3 days, resurrection becomes less a victory and more a performance. But God is not in the business of performances. He doesn't dazzle to distract. He waits to deepen. He allows time to press in so that when the miracle comes, we don't just witness it, we need it. We crave it. We fall to our knees not in shock, but in worship. The resurrection, then, becomes not a flashy interruption, but the natural breaking of dawn after the long, dark night. And when the sun rises after 3 days of grief, it doesn't just light up the sky, it warms the very soul. And this brings us to what it all means for you and me. Because this ancient story is not just a historical event to admire, it's a pattern that plays out in your life again and again. You may not be laid in a tomb, but you felt buried. You felt the silence. You've known what it's like to lose something you thought would last, someone you loved, a dream you cherished, a belief you held close. You've had days when the stone rolled shut on your heart and nothing made sense. Days when prayers echoed into emptiness. Days when you thought, this is it. It's over. And maybe, just like the disciples, you've started to grieve before the story was even finished. But here's the truth, hidden in the waiting. The third day always comes. It doesn't always come when you want it to. It doesn't always look how you imagined. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, almost invisibly. A shift in your heart, a tiny spark of peace, a moment of stillness that reminds you you are not alone, that the silence is not abandonment, that something sacred is unfolding beneath the surface. Because God never leaves the tomb sealed forever. He lets you stay there just long enough to transform, to release the parts of you that can't follow you into resurrection. The fear, the control, the illusions, the shallow faith that demands immediate answers. And when those things have died, that's when the stone begins to move. That's when you rise. But you rise differently. You don't come back the same. The resurrection doesn't restore the past. It births something new, something deeper, stronger, quieter, more enduring. Jesus didn't come back to pick up where he left off. He came back transformed, glorified. He wasn't just continuing his life. He was beginning a whole new reality. And the same is true for us. Resurrection is not a rewind. It's a recreation. So whatever tomb you find yourself in, take heart. Whatever silence you're sitting in, don't rush it. Whatever unanswered prayer or long stretch of waiting you're enduring, know this: you are not being forgotten. You are being prepared. The third day will come, not because you force it, not because you earn it, but because God is faithful. So let the waiting shape you. Let the silence deepen you. Let the grief soften you. Because when the stone finally rolls away, you'll see it wasn't just about coming back to life. It was about becoming someone new.